Millbrook was the kind of small town that forgot veterans existed until they needed one. My name is Jake. I'm 64, and for 2 years this community treated me like damaged goods, the broken soldier who couldn't adapt to civilian life. They whispered about my PTSD, crossed streets to avoid me, and made it clear I didn't belong. Then ISIS sleeper cells hit our town at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and suddenly the crazy old soldier became the only thing standing between 3,000 innocent people and a coordinated terrorist massacre. But let me start at the beginning, because this story isn't just about one morning of violence. It's about 2 years of isolation, rejection, and a community that learned the hard way that the people they fear most might be exactly the people they need most when evil comes calling. I rolled into Millbrook, Kansas in September 2021, driving a beat-up pickup truck with everything I owned crammed into the bed and covered by a top that had seen better decades. 26 years in the Army, including 12 years in Special Forces, and this was what I had to show for it. A disability pension, a Purple Heart I kept in a shoebox, and enough psychological damage to make civilian life feel like navigating a minefield blindfolded. Millbrook looked perfect from the highway, population 32-0. Surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, Main Street, lined with family businesses that had weathered the Great Depression and somehow survived the Walmart invasion of the 1990s. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where kids could still ride bikes without parents worrying, where the biggest crime was usually teenagers drinking beer behind the grain elevator. It was exactly what I thought I needed after spending the last decade in places where children carried bombs and every friendly face might hide a suicide vest. I rented a small house on Elm Street from Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s who seemed genuinely happy to have a tenant who could help with maintenance and wouldn't throw wild parties. The house was simple, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, but it had a front porch and a backyard where I could sit without feeling like I needed to watch my six. For the first month, I thought I'd found what I was looking for. The illusion lasted exactly as long as it took for Millbrook to figure out who their new resident really was. The first sign of trouble came at Murphy's Hardware, where I went to buy basic supplies for fixing up the house. I was looking at paint colors when the owner, a man about my age named Bill Murphy, struck up what seemed like friendly conversation. "You're the new guy on Elm Street, right, Jake? What's the last name?" "Morrison," I said, not looking up from the paint samples. "Morrison, military, I'm guessing. You've got that bearing." I should have lied. Should have said I was retired from construction or trucking or anything except the truth. But I'd been living with lies and half-truths for so long that sometimes honesty felt like a luxury I couldn't afford to pass up. "Army. 26 years. No kidding. What kind of army work?" "Infantry, mostly. Special forces for the last 12 years." The change in Bill Murphy's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The friendly curiosity shifted to something more guarded, more careful. "Special forces, like Green Berets, something like that." "Ha, must have seen some action overseas." "Some. Afghanistan, Iraq, both. Few other places." Bill Murphy nodded like he was processing information he wasn't sure he wanted to have. "Well, welcome to Millbrook. Hope you find it peaceful." The way he said peaceful made it sound like a warning. I bought my paint and left, but I could feel Murphy's eyes on me the entire time. By the time I got home, I had the distinct feeling that my military service was going to be a bigger factor in my Millbrook experience than I'd hoped. I was right. Within a week, it was clear that news of the Special Forces veteran on Elm Street had made its way through Millbrook's informal communication network. The reactions were varied, but none of them were what I'd hoped for. At the post office, the clerk, a young woman named Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 25, handled my mail like it might explode. When I asked about getting a P.O. box, she suggested I might be more comfortable with the postal services in the next town over. At the grocery store, other customers gave me a wide berth in the aisles. I overheard one conversation between two middle-aged women in the cereal section. That new man on Elm Street. Linda Murphy says he's some kind of military assassin or something. Assassin. Special forces. You know, the ones who do the secret killings overseas. What's he doing in Millbrook? That's what everyone's wondering. Normal soldiers don't usually end up in places like this unless something went wrong. I kept shopping, pretending I hadn't heard, but the damage was done. In their minds, I wasn't a retired veteran looking for peace. I was a potential threat who brought unknown dangers to their safe community. The children's reactions were the worst. Kids have radar for adult anxiety, and they picked up on their parents' unease around me immediately. When I walked down the street, children would cross to the other side or duck behind their mother's legs. A few times, I caught kids staring at me from windows like I was some kind of monster from their nightmares. One afternoon, I was working in my front yard when a group of neighborhood kids walked by on their way home from school. One of them, a boy maybe 10 years old, looked directly at me and asked his friend in a voice loud enough for me to hear, "Is that the man who kills people?" My mom says he might have PTSD and could snap at any moment, the friend replied. What's PTSD? It's when soldiers go crazy and start shooting random people. I went inside and didn't come back out for the rest of the day. 3 months after moving to Millbrook, I made the mistake of trying to eat breakfast at Rosie's Diner, the local gathering place where farmers discussed crop prices and retirees solved the world's problems over coffee and eggs. I should have known better, should have recognized that inserting myself into the social center of a community that was already suspicious of me would only make things worse. But I was lonely, tired of eating alone, and desperately hoping that face-to-face interaction might help people see me as something other than a potential threat. I was wrong. The moment I walked into Rosie's, conversation stopped like someone had flipped a switch. 25 people turned to stare at the newcomer who just invaded their sanctuary. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable, then slowly resumed at a lower volume. I took a seat at the counter, nodding politely to the waitress, an older woman with graying hair and tired eyes who looked like she'd been pouring coffee since the Kennedy administration. Coffee? She asked, but her tone suggested she was hoping I'd say no. Please, and I'll take 2 eggs over easy bacon wheat toast. She poured the coffee and walked away without the kind of small talk that seemed to flow freely for every other customer in the place. That's when I noticed the conversation at the table behind me had shifted to a discussion that was clearly intended for my benefit. Heard from my cousin in Topeka that these special forces guys come back pretty messed up. PTSD, anger problems, drinking. They train them to be killers, but they don't train them how to stop being killers when they come home. Makes sense. You spend years learning how to hurt people. That's got to change you inside. Question is, what's one of them doing in a place like Millbrook? We don't have any military bases here, no VA hospital, no reason for a soldier to choose this place unless. Unless what? Unless he's running from something. Maybe got in trouble somewhere else and needed to disappear. I ate my breakfast in silence, paid my bill, and left without making eye contact with anyone. As I walked out, I heard one more comment that followed me to my truck. Did you see his hands shake when he was holding the coffee cup? That's not normal. My hands hadn't been shaking from fear or instability. They'd been shaking from anger, the kind of controlled rage that comes from listening to ignorant people make assumptions about your character based on nothing more than prejudice and stupidity. But explaining that would have required starting a conversation I wasn't sure I could finish without proving their point about veterans with anger problems. The irony of Millbrook's fear was that their suspicion actually made my PTSD symptoms worse, which then reinforced their belief that I was unstable and dangerous. PTSD isn't what movies make it look like. It's not constant flashbacks and dramatic breakdowns. For me, it was hypervigilance, an inability to turn off the threat detection systems that had kept me alive through multiple combat deployments. In Afghanistan and Iraq, scanning for potential threats was a survival skill. Noting who was where, how they were moving, what they were carrying, whether their behavior patterns suggested hostile intent. All of that was just good soldiering in an environment where relaxing your guard could get you and your team killed. In civilian life, that same hypervigilance made people uncomfortable. When I walked into a room, I automatically assessed exits, sight lines, potential cover positions, and possible threats. When I sat in restaurants, I chose seats that let me see the entrance and gave me options for movement. When I drove, I constantly checked mirrors and alternate routes. To me, these were just habits, unconscious behaviors that made me feel more secure in environments that still felt unpredictable and dangerous. To the people of Millbrook, they looked like the actions of someone who was planning something violent. The situation came to a head at the town's 4th of July celebration. I decided to attend, hoping that a patriotic event might be a place where a veteran could feel welcome. Instead, it became a demonstration of everything that was wrong with how Millbrook saw me. I arrived at the town park around noon, when families were spreading blankets for picnics and kids were running around with sparklers and small flags. It should have been relaxing, the kind of peaceful community gathering I'd been hoping to find. Instead, my combat instincts kicked in immediately. Large crowds in open spaces triggered all my threat detection systems. I found myself automatically scanning the perimeter, noting potential sniper positions, assessing the crowd for suspicious behavior patterns. What looked like normal family fun to everyone else looked like a security nightmare to me. Too many people, too many sight lines, too many variables to control if something went wrong. I lasted about 20 minutes before the hypervigilance became overwhelming and I had to leave. But 20 minutes was long enough for half the town to observe the crazy veteran acting paranoid and suspicious at a family event. Sheriff Davis approached me as I was walking back to my truck. "Everything okay, Jake?" "Yeah, just. Crowds aren't really my thing. I noticed you seemed pretty focused on the tree line over there. Looking for something specific. How do you explain to a small-town sheriff that you were conducting automatic threat assessments because your brain was still programmed for environments where children might be carrying bombs? How do you say that large gatherings made you nervous because you'd seen too many markets and festivals turned into slaughter zones by hidden explosives? Just old habits, I said. Nothing to worry about." But Sheriff Davis's expression suggested he was definitely worrying. And by the next day, the story of the veteran who'd spent the 4th of July celebration casing the joint had spread through Millbrook's gossip network like wildfire. By October, it was clear that my savings wouldn't last forever, and I needed to find work. Millbrook's job market was limited mostly agricultural work, some retail positions, and a few service jobs that required interaction with the public. I applied for a position at the grain elevator, figuring that physical labor and limited human interaction would suit both my skills and my social situation. The job interview with manager Tom Harrison lasted exactly 7 minutes. "Says here you're military," Harrison noted, looking at my application. 26 years Army, retired as a Master Sergeant. "What kind of work did you do?" "Infantry, mainly. Some specialized roles." "Specialized how?" I should have been vague, but honesty seemed like the right approach. "Special forces, counter-terrorism, unconventional warfare, that sort of thing." Harrison's expression shifted. "Counter-terrorism? Like killing terrorists?" "Among other things, yes. And now you want to work at a grain elevator. I want to work somewhere quiet where I can earn a living without bothering anyone." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "Jake, I'm gonna be straight with you. This is a small town and people talk. There's been some concern about having someone with your background working around our facilities." "What kind of concern?" "Look, I'm not saying it's fair, but people are worried about PTSD, about what might happen if you have some kind of episode around heavy equipment or in a confined space with other workers. I've never had an episode that put anyone at risk. Maybe not, but the perception is there. And in a small town, perception is reality. I was rejected for 3 more jobs over the next 2 weeks. A position at the hardware store, customers might be uncomfortable. A maintenance job at the school district, parents are concerned about having military personnel around their children. And even a night shift position at the gas station, insurance liability issues with employees who have combat backgrounds. Each rejection was polite, carefully worded to avoid anything that could be considered discrimination. But the message was clear. Millbrook didn't want a combat veteran in any position where he might interact with the community or have access to anything that could be considered sensitive. In November, Sheriff Davis knocked on my door with a request that was technically voluntary but felt distinctly mandatory. Jake, I know this might sound odd, but the town council has asked me to discuss something with you. What kind of something? Well, there's been some concern in the community about your adjustment to civilian life. People notice things, the way you watch crowds, how you position yourself in public spaces, some of the behaviors that might indicate you're struggling with your transition home. I knew where this was going, but I let him continue. The thing is, we've got a lot of families with young kids here, and when people are worried about potential safety issues, it creates tension that's not good for anyone. Sheriff, I haven't broken any laws, threatened anyone, or given you any reason to believe I'm dangerous. No, you haven't. But prevention is better than reaction, if you know what I mean. What are you asking me to do? The town council would like you to undergo a voluntary psychological evaluation, just to establish that you're stable, handling your PTSD appropriately, not a risk to yourself or others. Think of it as community relations. And if I refuse, well, it's voluntary. But refusing might send the wrong message to people who are already concerned. The evaluation was conducted by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychiatrist who drove down from Wichita once a week to provide mental health services to the county. She was professional, thorough, and clearly uncomfortable with the political nature of her assignment. Jake, I want to be clear that this evaluation was requested by local officials, not ordered by any court or medical authority. You don't have to answer any questions you don't want to answer. I understand. What do you want to know? We spent 2 hours discussing my military service, my combat experiences, my symptoms, and my coping strategies. Dr. Martinez asked about flashbacks, nightmares, anger issues, substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts. She administered several standardized assessments for PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. At the end of the session, she delivered her conclusions with the kind of careful language that suggested she was trying to balance medical honesty with political necessity. Jake, your PTSD symptoms are consistent with what I'd expect from someone with your service record. You're not psychotic, not actively suicidal, and not presenting any immediate danger to yourself or others. Your coping strategies are healthy, your insight into your condition is good, and your social functioning is within normal ranges. But, but you are dealing with significant hypervigilance and social anxiety that might be concerning to people who don't understand combat trauma. Your threat assessment behaviors, while normal for someone with your background, could be misinterpreted by civilians as suspicious or potentially dangerous. So I'm not crazy, but I look crazy to people who don't know what they're looking at. That's not how I'd phrase it, but essentially accurate. Dr. Martinez's report to the town council was supposed to be confidential, but this was Millbrook Population 32-0, where confidentiality was more of a guideline than a rule. Within a week, everyone knew that the veteran on Elm Street had been psychologically evaluated and cleared for now, but needs monitoring. The evaluation that was supposed to reassure the community instead reinforced their belief that I was a potential problem requiring professional oversight. December through March were the hardest months I'd experienced since coming home from Afghanistan. The combination of seasonal depression, social isolation, and constant community suspicion created a psychological pressure cooker that tested every coping strategy I'd developed. I stopped going to public places unless absolutely necessary. Grocery shopping became a once-weekly sprint through the store with my head down and minimal interaction with other customers or staff. I had my mail delivered to a P.O. box to avoid conversations with neighbors who might be monitoring my behavior. The isolation was its own form of torture. Human beings are social animals, and cutting yourself off from community interaction, even hostile community interaction, creates a psychological void that's hard to fill with hobbies and television. I spent my days reading, doing home improvement projects, and taking long walks in the countryside outside town, where I wouldn't encounter people who might find my presence disturbing. I developed a routine that kept me busy and productive, but didn't require me to navigate the social minefield that Millbrook had become. But isolation also gave me time to observe things that other people were too busy or too trusting to notice, like the new faces that had been appearing in town since January. At first, I dismissed it as normal population fluctuation. Small towns always have people coming and going, seasonal workers, relatives visiting for extended stays, newcomers looking for affordable housing. But my hypervigilance, the same trait that made Millbrook uncomfortable, started picking up patterns that didn't feel right. The newcomers weren't integrating into the community the way normal residents did. They kept to themselves, avoided eye contact, and seemed more interested in observing local routines than participating in them. Most concerning, they all appeared to be young men of Middle Eastern or North African appearance who'd arrived separately but seemed to know each other. In Afghanistan and Iraq, I'd learned to read social dynamics in communities where hostile actors tried to blend in with civilian populations. These new residents in Millbrook were displaying exactly the kind of behavior patterns that set off alarm bells in counter-terrorism operations. They were conducting surveillance. In February, I made the mistake of trying to share my concerns with local authorities. I should have known better. A paranoid veteran reporting suspicious activity by foreign-looking men was exactly the kind of thing that would confirm Millbrook's worst fears about my mental stability. I started with Sheriff Davis, approaching him at the courthouse with what I hoped was a calm, rational presentation of my observations. "Sheriff, I wanted to talk to you about some people I've noticed around town. There are several new residents who seem to be conducting surveillance of local facilities and routines." Sheriff Davis looked at me with the expression of a man who was dealing with exactly the problem he'd been expecting. "Surveillance? What kind of surveillance?" "Systematic observation of the school, the grain elevator, the water treatment plant, traffic patterns, emergency response procedures. The kind of reconnaissance that precedes operational planning." "Jake, are you sure you're not reading too much into normal behavior? People look around when they're new to a place. These aren't tourists or job seekers. These are trained individuals conducting professional intelligence gathering." "Trained by who?" "I don't know yet, but their methodology is consistent with hostile reconnaissance I've seen in theater." Sheriff Davis was quiet for a long moment. "Jake, I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be letting your military background influence how you interpret everyday behavior." "Sheriff, I'm not having a PTSD episode. I'm reporting potential threats based on observable behavior patterns." "I understand you believe that, but from where I sit, what you're describing sounds like exactly the kind of hypervigilance and paranoid thinking that Dr. Martinez said we should monitor. So you're not going to investigate. I'm going to keep an eye on things, like I always do. But I'm not going to harass newcomers based on one person's suspicions, especially when that person has documented issues with threat perception." I tried the FBI field office in Wichita, but they were even less receptive. The agent I spoke with listened politely to my report, took some notes, and promised to look into it in a tone that suggested my call would be filed under probable crank. When I mentioned my concerns to Dr. Martinez during our next monthly check-in, she spent most of the session exploring whether my threat perception issues were becoming more pronounced and whether I might benefit from adjusted medication. Nobody wanted to hear that the crazy veteran might be right about something important. It was easier to dismiss my warnings as symptoms of mental illness than to consider the possibility that my experience in identifying hostile actors might actually be relevant to community security. But the surveillance continued, and the patterns became more obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. By April, I documented at least 8 individuals who were conducting systematic reconnaissance of Millbrook's infrastructure and routines. They'd mapped the school's security procedures, timed police response to different areas of town, identified the locations of utility controls and emergency services. More concerning, they'd begun stockpiling supplies in houses they were renting on the outskirts of town. I'd observed delivery trucks arriving at odd hours, carrying cargo that the recipients handled with the kind of care you use for sensitive materials. Everything about their behavior screamed operational preparation. These weren't immigrants trying to integrate into American society. These were operators preparing for a mission. I made one final attempt to warn local authorities, this time taking my evidence to Mayor Richardson, hoping that a more detailed presentation might get through where verbal reports had failed. I brought photographs, timelines, maps showing surveillance routes, and detailed behavioral analyses that demonstrated clear patterns of hostile reconnaissance. Mayor Richardson listened politely, examined my materials with appropriate seriousness, and then delivered the response I should have expected. Jake, this is very thorough work, and I can see you've put a lot of time into it. But I have to be honest, what you're describing sounds like the kind of elaborate conspiracy thinking that sometimes develops in people who are struggling with trauma-related mental health issues. Mayor, I'm not making this up. These are real people conducting real surveillance of real targets. I'm sure they're real people. But the idea that Millbrook, a farming town in the middle of Kansas, would be targeted by some kind of terrorist cell, that's just not realistic. Sir, with respect, small towns are exactly the kinds of targets that terrorists use to demonstrate that nowhere in America is safe. Low security, high impact, maximum psychological effect. Jake, I appreciate your military background, but I think your experiences overseas might be making you see threats where none exist. What would it take to convince you I'm right? Mayor Richardson thought about that question longer than I expected. Honestly, probably nothing. Because if you're right, we're all in terrible danger, and there's not much we can do about it. And if you're wrong, we've wasted time and resources chasing shadows based on the paranoid fantasies of someone who's already had psychological evaluation. So you're choosing to believe I'm wrong. I'm choosing to believe that the most likely explanation is usually correct. And the most likely explanation is that you're a combat veteran struggling with threat perception issues, not that our town is under surveillance by international terrorists. That conversation ended my attempts to work through official channels. If Millbrook was going to survive what was coming, it would be despite their leadership, not because of it. I spent the next month preparing for what I was increasingly certain would be a coordinated attack on the town. I couldn't stop it from happening. One man against a trained terrorist cell isn't good odds, but I might be able to limit the damage if I was ready when it started. I inventoried my weapons and ammunition, planned defensive positions and escape routes, and tried to identify potential civilian casualties who I might be able to protect or evacuate. Most importantly, I prepared mentally for the possibility that I might have to kill people in defense of a community that had spent 2 years trying to convince me I was too dangerous to live among them. May brought Millbrook's annual Harvest Festival, the biggest community event of the year. 3 days of food vendors, live music, craft booths, and family entertainment that brought together not just local residents, but visitors from surrounding towns and counties. Perfect target for a terrorist attack designed to maximize casualties and psychological impact. The surveillance activity around town increased dramatically in the weeks leading up to the festival. I documented multiple reconnaissance passes of the festival grounds, timing studies of crowd patterns, and what appeared to be rehearsals of approach routes and defensive positions. On May 15th, I observed what looked like a final operational meeting at one of the safe houses. 8 men arriving separately, staying for 3 hours, leaving with the kind of purposeful demeanor that suggested important decisions had been made. That night, I made one final attempt to warn someone in authority. I called Sheriff Davis at home and tried to convey the urgency of what I'd observed. Sheriff, they're going to hit the Harvest Festival. Probably opening day, maximum crowds, multiple casualties. Jake, we've been through this. You think you see terrorists everywhere. Sir, I'm begging you, just increase security for the festival. Post extra deputies, check identification, search bags. If I'm wrong, you've wasted some overtime budget. If I'm right, you'll save lives. Jake, I can't justify that kind of security response based on your suspicions. It would panic the community and destroy the festival. Better a cancelled festival than a massacre. Nothing's going to happen, Jake. Get some help. He hung up. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours before dawn checking my equipment, reviewing my plans, and accepting that when the attack came, and I was certain it was coming, I would be fighting alone. Tuesday, May 16th, 6:17 a.m. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when I heard the first explosions from downtown. Two loud booms, maybe 30 seconds apart, followed by the sound of automatic weapons fire and screaming. Every instinct I'd developed in 12 years of special forces operations kicked in immediately. This wasn't random violence or a domestic dispute. This was a coordinated assault by multiple attackers using military tactics. The Harvest Festival didn't officially start until 10 a.m., but vendors and volunteers had been setting up since dawn. The terrorists had timed their attack to catch the maximum number of people in the open with minimal security and no escape routes. I grabbed my gear and ran toward the sound of gunfire. Main Street was chaos. Two vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices had detonated simultaneously at opposite ends of the festival area, sealing off the main escape routes and trapping approximately 200 people in the kill zone. Multiple gunmen were firing into the crowd from elevated positions, while others moved through the festival grounds, executing wounded civilians. In the first 30 seconds, I counted at least 6 separate shooters using automatic weapons, professional positioning, and coordinated fields of fire. This wasn't a random attack by amateurs. This was a well-planned military operation designed to maximize casualties and prevent effective response. Sheriff Davis was on the ground near his patrol car, clutching a leg wound and shouting into his radio. Shots fired, multiple shooters, need backup now. But backup was 20 minutes away, and 200 people would be dead in 5 minutes if someone didn't act immediately. I moved to a position behind the post office that gave me sight lines on two of the shooters while keeping me concealed from the others. My first shot took down a gunman who was firing into a group of families hiding behind overturned tables. My second shot eliminated a sniper who had positioned himself on the roof of Murphy's Hardware. That got their attention. The moment I opened fire, the entire dynamic of the attack changed. Instead of hunting defenseless civilians, the terrorists suddenly had to deal with effective return fire from someone who understood their tactics and could match their skills. Two of them immediately shifted position to engage me, which meant they weren't shooting at festival goers. That gave civilians time to find better cover and begin moving towards safer areas. But I was one man against at least 6 trained operators, and they had superior positioning and more ammunition. If I stayed in one location, they would flank me within minutes. I needed to move, and I needed to force them to react to me instead of executing their planned massacre. Using smoke grenades I'd brought from my personal kit, I obscured their sight lines and began moving through the downtown area in a pattern designed to draw them away from the civilians they'd come to kill. The next 15 minutes were the most intense urban combat I'd experienced since Ramadi. Moving from building to building, using my knowledge of Millbrook's layout to stay one step ahead of operators who were trying to corner me in a coordinated pursuit. I took out two more shooters, one in the alley behind the bank, another who had positioned himself to cover the approach to the elementary school. Each engagement revealed more about their training and tactics. These weren't ISIS amateurs. These were professionally trained operators with military-grade equipment and sophisticated coordination. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their planning. They'd assumed Millbrook would be defended only by local police who would be overwhelmed in the first minutes of the attack. They hadn't planned for resistance from someone with equivalent training who knew the terrain better than they did. At 6:45 a.m., I intercepted radio chatter indicating that part of the terrorist team was moving toward Millbrook Elementary School, where approximately 50 children were attending early morning daycare before the festival. This was the moment every parent's nightmare becomes reality: armed terrorists targeting children who have no way to defend themselves and nowhere to run. I reached the school 3 minutes ahead of the terrorist team and found chaos inside. Teachers were trying to implement lockdown procedures while children cried and asked questions no child should have to ask. "Everyone into the interior hallway," I shouted, taking charge of a situation where hesitation would mean death. "Away from windows, stay low, stay quiet." Principal Sarah Matthews, a woman I'd never spoken to but who had definitely heard all the rumors about the unstable veteran, looked at me with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Are you here to help us or hurt us?" she asked, and I realized that even in this moment, even with gunfire echoing outside, she wasn't sure whether I was a rescuer or another threat. "I'm here to keep your kids alive," I said. "How many children are in the building?" 47 kids, 8 adults. "Any other exits besides the main entrance?" "Fire exits on the east and west sides, but they're alarmed." "Alarms don't matter anymore. Get everyone to the west exit and be ready to evacuate on my signal." Through the windows, I could see 4 armed men approaching the school in tactical formation. They had explosive devices, probably intended to breach the main entrance and trap everyone inside for systematic execution. I had maybe 90 seconds to prepare a defense that would protect 55 innocent people from 4 trained killers. This was what I'd been trained for, what I'd spent 12 years perfecting in the worst places on Earth. But I'd never fought for stakes this personal, never had to protect children whose parents had spent 2 years calling me too dangerous to live in their community. What happened next was the most important firefight of my life. The terrorists approached the school expecting to encounter hiding teachers and terrified children. Instead, they walked into a defensive position prepared by someone who understood their tactics and had superior knowledge of the terrain. I'd positioned myself in the main hallway with overlapping fields of fire that would force them to come at me one at a time through a fatal funnel. More importantly, I'd placed myself between them and the children. If they wanted to reach those kids, they had to go through me first. The first terrorist through the door took 2 rounds center mass before he could acquire a target. The second one was smarter, using cover and trying to flank my position, but I'd anticipated that approach and had prepared a secondary position that gave me angles on his movement. The third and fourth terrorists tried to coordinate their approach, using suppressive fire to pin me down while one of them moved to a better position. Professional tactics, well executed, exactly what I would have done in their situation. But they were fighting in my chosen terrain, with my prepared defenses, and I was fighting for something more important than any mission objective I'd ever been given. When the shooting stopped, 4 terrorists were dead and 55 innocent people were alive. Principal Matthews found me reloading in the hallway, surrounded by the kind of violence she'd probably never imagined could happen in her school. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, monitoring radio chatter that indicated more attacks were happening across town. "But your kids are safe. Get them out of here while I deal with the rest." I owe you an apology," she said. "We all do. We thought you were dangerous." "I am dangerous," I replied, checking my remaining ammunition. "Just not to the people I'm supposed to protect." By 7:15 a.m., I'd eliminated 6 of the 8 terrorists I'd identified, but the attacks were continuing across multiple locations. The surviving operators had adapted their tactics and were now conducting a running battle through the downtown area, using hostages and human shields to prevent effective engagement. This was the nightmare scenario that counter-terrorism forces train for but hope never to encounter. Hostile actors operating in close proximity to civilians, making every shot a risk to innocent lives. I moved back toward the festival grounds, where approximately 100 people were still trapped by crossfire between the remaining terrorists and arriving police units. Sheriff Davis was trying to coordinate a response, but his deputies were outgunned and outtrained by opponents they'd never been prepared to face. "Morrison," Sheriff Davis called out when he saw me approaching. "What's your status?" "School secured, 6 hostiles down, 2 still active in the downtown area." "6? Jesus Christ, Jake. I owe you an apology. Save it for later. What's the tactical situation?" "2 gunmen have taken hostages in the bank. They're demanding transportation and threatening to execute civilians if we don't comply. SWAT team is 40 minutes out." 40 minutes was 39 minutes too long. Hostage situations with ideologically motivated terrorists don't end in negotiation. They end in mass execution, followed by suicide attacks. "Sheriff, I need you to trust me on this. Those men didn't come here to negotiate. They came here to kill as many people as possible before they die. Every minute we wait is another minute they're planning how to maximize casualties." "What are you suggesting?" "Let me handle it." Sheriff Davis looked at me. This man his community had tried to convince was too unstable to live among them, and made a decision that required remarkable courage. "Do it!" The First National Bank of Millbrook was a single-story brick building with large windows facing Main Street and a single entrance. Under normal circumstances, it would be nearly impossible to assault without getting hostages killed. But I had advantages the terrorists didn't know about. I'd been inside the bank dozens of times over the past 2 years. I knew the layout better than they did, and I understood their psychological profile well enough to predict their behavior patterns. More importantly, I was fighting alone, which meant I could move without coordination delays and adapt my tactics in real time based on what I observed. I approached the bank through the alley behind the building, using a route that kept me out of sight from the windows. The terrorists had positioned themselves to watch the front entrance and the street, but they weren't expecting an approach from their blind spot. The bank's rear entrance was locked, but I'd learned lock picking in special forces for exactly this kind of situation. 90 seconds later, I was inside the building and moving toward the main banking floor where the hostages were being held. Through the interior glass partition, I could see 12 civilians on the floor, bank employees and early customers who'd been in the wrong place when the attack began. 2 terrorists were guarding them, both armed with automatic weapons and wearing explosive vests. Suicide bombers change the calculus of any engagement. Even perfect shots that immediately incapacitate the targets might not prevent them from triggering their devices and killing everyone in the blast radius. But I'd dealt with suicide bombers before, and I'd learned that their greatest weakness is their commitment to martyrdom. They expect to die, which makes them predictable in ways that survival-oriented opponents aren't. I had one advantage they didn't expect. They thought they were dealing with local police who would try to negotiate or wait for SWAT teams. They weren't prepared for immediate, aggressive action from someone who understood that the only way to save the hostages was to kill the terrorists before they could trigger their devices. The assault lasted 11 seconds. Two shots, two dead terrorists, 12 living hostages, and a town that would never again question whether their unwanted veteran was on their side. By 8:30 a.m., the terrorist attack on Millbrook was over. 8 trained operators who had come to massacre American civilians were dead, killed by a single defender who had refused to let his community be destroyed despite 2 years of rejection and suspicion. The casualty count could have been catastrophic. 200 festival goers, 55 people at the school, 12 bank hostages, plus whatever secondary attacks the terrorists had planned for later in the day. Instead, the final tally was 0 civilian deaths and 3 wounded, all injuries sustained before I engaged the attackers. It was the kind of counter-terrorism success that professionals study and politicians claim credit for, accomplished by one man with a rifle and the training to use it effectively. But the real transformation wasn't tactical, it was social. As word spread through Millbrook about what had happened, the community that had spent 2 years treating me like a dangerous outsider began to understand exactly how dangerous I really was to their enemies, not to them. Sheriff Davis held a press conference that afternoon where he explained to local and national media what had occurred. This morning, Millbrook was targeted by a coordinated terrorist attack designed to kill as many innocent people as possible. The attack was stopped by retired Master Sergeant Jake Morrison, a Special Forces veteran who single-handedly engaged and eliminated 8 terrorists, saving hundreds of lives in the process. Master Sergeant Morrison is a hero in every sense of the word. Our community owes him a debt that can never be repaid. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd been paying attention for the past 2 years. The man they'd called too dangerous to live in their town had turned out to be the only thing standing between them and annihilation. The FBI investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Millbrook had narrowly avoided. The terrorist cell had been planning their attack for over a year, conducting exactly the kind of systematic surveillance that I'd tried to warn people about. Their target wasn't just the Harvest Festival, it was the entire community. They'd planned secondary attacks on the school, the hospital, the grain elevator, and residential neighborhoods. The goal was to kill as many Americans as possible and demonstrate that nowhere in the heartland was safe from jihadi terrorism. The investigation also revealed that my warnings to local authorities had been correct in every detail. The reconnaissance reports I'd filed with Sheriff Davis, the behavioral analyses I'd presented to Mayor Richardson, the threat assessments I'd tried to share with the FBI, all of it had been accurate intelligence that could have prevented the attack entirely if anyone had taken it seriously. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, who led the investigation, met with me 3 days after the attack to discuss my observations and the intelligence I'd gathered over the past 6 months. Mr. Morrison, your reporting on this cell was more comprehensive and accurate than anything our field agents produced. How did you identify them so quickly? Same way I identified hostile actors in Afghanistan and Iraq. Behavior patterns, surveillance methods, operational preparation. The techniques don't change much regardless of location. Why didn't anyone listen to your warnings? Because a crazy veteran reporting suspicious Muslims fit everyone's preconceptions about PTSD paranoia better than the possibility that I might actually know what I was talking about. Agent Santos was quiet for a moment. Sir, I want to apologize on behalf of the Bureau. Your reports should have been taken seriously. If they had been, this attack could have been prevented. Apology accepted. But the real lesson here isn't about intelligence gathering. It's about how communities treat the people who have skills they might need in a crisis. The weeks following the attack brought a complete transformation in how Millbrook treated me, but it wasn't the kind of hero worship you might expect. Instead, it was something deeper and more meaningful. genuine respect based on understanding. People began approaching me not as a celebrity or a curiosity, but as someone whose experience and skills had value to the community. They asked questions about security, about threat assessment, about how to prepare for emergencies they'd never imagined could happen in rural Kansas. Principal Matthews invited me to speak to her teachers about school security and threat recognition. Sheriff Davis asked me to help train his deputies in active shooter response and counterterrorism tactics. Mayor Richardson requested my input on emergency preparedness planning and infrastructure protection. Most importantly, parents who had once pulled their children away from me began bringing those same children to thank me for keeping them safe. Kids who had been taught to fear the dangerous veteran now asked to hear stories about my military service and what it meant to protect others. The transformation wasn't just about me. It was about Millbrook learning to value the kinds of people and skills they'd previously rejected out of fear and ignorance. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly landlord, summed it up best during a conversation we had a month after the attack. "Jake, I have to tell you something. When I first rented you this house, I was scared. People said you were dangerous, that you had problems, that maybe I shouldn't have a veteran living on my property. And now I understand that you were always dangerous to anyone who would threaten the people you care about. I just didn't understand the difference between being dangerous and being a danger." 6 months after the attack, I received more official recognition than I'd gotten in 26 years of military service. The governor of Kansas presented me with the state's highest civilian honor. The Department of Defense awarded me their medal for distinguished public service. The FBI gave me their Public Service Award, and the Department of Homeland Security created a new commendation specifically to recognize my actions. But the recognition that meant the most came from Millbrook itself. The town council unanimously voted to name May 16th Defender Day, a permanent holiday to commemorate not just my actions, but the importance of welcoming and valuing veterans in civilian communities. They commissioned a memorial in the town square with the inscription, "To Master Sergeant Jake Morrison and all veterans who stand between America and those who would harm her. Your service continues, your sacrifice is remembered, and your place in our community is honored." The memorial ceremony drew over 2,000 people from across Kansas and beyond. Veterans organizations, law enforcement agencies, and military units sent representatives. Gold Star families came to honor someone who had prevented other families from experiencing their loss. But the moment that broke me down completely came when the children from Millbrook Elementary School presented me with a banner they'd made themselves. "Thank you for keeping us safe when no one else believed in you." 2 years later, I'm still in Millbrook, but my role in the community has evolved far beyond what I'd originally hoped for when I arrived with a pickup truck and dreams of quiet retirement. I serve as the town's emergency preparedness coordinator, a position created specifically to make sure Millbrook never again ignores expert warnings about potential threats. I train local law enforcement in counterterrorism tactics, help schools develop security protocols, and work with federal agencies to identify and investigate potential threats in the region. More importantly, I've become part of a network of veterans throughout Kansas who are working to change how small communities understand and integrate military experience. We provide security consulting, emergency response training, and threat assessment services to towns that previously had no way to prepare for the kinds of dangers that exist in the modern world. The hypervigilance that once made people uncomfortable is now recognized as a valuable asset for community security. The combat skills that seemed threatening to peaceful civilians are now understood as resources that might be needed when peace is under attack. My PTSD symptoms haven't disappeared. I still have nightmares, still struggle with crowds sometimes, still carry the invisible wounds of 26 years in dangerous places. But Millbrook has learned to see those struggles as evidence of what I've endured to develop the skills that saved their lives, not as signs of instability that make me unsuitable for their community. The terrorist attack on Millbrook taught lessons that extend far beyond one small town in Kansas. It demonstrated how prejudice and fear can blind communities to the very resources they need to survive, and how the people society dismisses as broken or dangerous might be exactly the people who stand between civilization and those who would destroy it. Most importantly, it proved that veterans don't stop serving when they take off the uniform. The skills we learn, the training we receive, the protective instincts we develop, all of that continues to have value in civilian life, especially when civilian life comes under attack. The respect I have now in Millbrook isn't based on gratitude for a single day of heroic action. It's based on understanding what military service really means and why communities need to value the people who have chosen to make themselves dangerous in defense of others. That respect will never waver because it was earned under conditions that don't leave room for doubt. When terrorists came to kill their children, the community discovered that their broken veteran was the only thing standing between them and annihilation. They learned that being dangerous and being a danger are two completely different things, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in your community is exactly the person you most need on your side when evil comes calling. Millbrook is safer now, not just because of improved security measures or better emergency preparedness, but because they've learned to recognize and value the defenders who live among them. They understand that veterans aren't problems to be managed or threats to be monitored. They're resources to be valued and skills to be utilized. And they've passed those lessons on to their children, who will grow up understanding that the people who seem different or difficult might be exactly the people who will risk everything to keep them safe. That's the real victory that came out of May 16th, not just stopping a terrorist attack, but changing how an entire community thinks about the people who have sworn to protect them. Sometimes it takes a crisis to wash away the prejudices that blind us to the help we need. Sometimes it takes a terrorist attack to make people understand that the veteran they've been trying to drive away might be the only thing standing between them and annihilation. Millbrook learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it completely. And now they're teaching it to other communities across America. Embrace your veterans, value their skills, and understand that the person you least want in your neighborhood might be exactly the person you most need when hell comes calling. Because hell will come calling eventually. And when it does, you want to make sure you haven't driven away the people who know how to fight it.